This program is available in Passport because of your generous donation to your local PBS station. Thank you.
America, torchbearer of democracy in the Western world. And how fitting that this nation, raised on revolutionary expectations of equality, should take the most democratic of all beverages to heart.
Joe.
Joe, the common man's name for the Dutch 17th century trader's name for my favorite brew, coffee.
Coffee is an Ethiopian fruit, first drunk by Christian abbots and Muslim Sufis from the 10th century onwards. An auspicious sign, if ever there was one, that this was going to be the drink that would break all boundaries: religious, social, political, and economic.
Coffee is the lifeblood of farmers throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The daily cup of aristocrats, hipsters, the working man and woman. Everybody's been captivated by its aromatic charms and its slightly bitter pleasures. Yeah, Joe's become a worldwide phenomenon, employing tens of millions of people around the globe and raining manna from heaven on small coffee roasters and large corporations alike.
Oh yes, coffee is the largest trading commodity in the world after oil. It's a $40 billion industry. 380 million cups are quaffed by Americans every day.
A symbol of our revolution against the tea-taxing Brits. This is the drink that defines America. I'm Dean Cycon, coffee roaster and social entrepreneur.
And I'm Judith Jones, gourmet travelista and roving reporter. And together, we're going to tell you the story of how coffee conquered America.
Or how America conquered coffee. Good morning, America. Okay, first the bad news. Coffee was not born here. Nope, the story of Joe begins in a land far, far away, in the highlands of Kaffa that we now know as Ethiopia. I've been roasting coffee and working directly in the coffee villages for over 20 years, and I've always heard this story about Kaldi, the Ethiopian goat herd who first discovered coffee. Kaldi's watching his goats while they munch on the green leaves and the red cherries of a coffee plant. Well, the goats start to get excited. They start to prance. They start to shuck and to jive. Kaldi watches this. He goes home, and later that night, a curious Kaldi tries some of the berries. He sees a vision of the angel Gabriel. He gets really excited, something that pleased his wife, or was it the goats? I don't remember the story. But anyway, Kaldi takes the beans to the local monastery to see the abbot. The abbot takes a handful of these beans, chews on them, and spits out the bitter fruit into the fire, shouting, "Pah! The devil's fruit!" Ah, but then, out of the fire comes the alluring aroma of roasted coffee. Much too irresistible, even for an abbot. So was born our modern coffee. It's an apocryphal tale written in the 16th century, but its romanticism has stuck. And one thing's for sure, coffee is still grown in Ethiopia. We've heard all these stories about dancing goats and drunken monks and visions of Angel Gabriel, but what's the real story of coffee? Where did it start, and who first found it?
It was the Ethiopians, we think, and it was probably in the range of the 800 ADs. That was when someone first wrote about coffee. They didn't actually brew it until centuries later, but we think Arabica coffee was first recognized as a special tree sometime before 1000 AD, a long time ago.
Somehow that berry becomes ultimately a drink. What happened there? How'd that happen?
It's a berry from a tree. The leaves have caffeine in it, the fruit has caffeine in it, and the seed itself has caffeine in it, but the seed is really hard. It certainly wasn't consumed as the coffee we know it today right away. They used the leaf, and they would dry it and make a little tea out of it. They would use the fruit, which was easy to take off, and they would dry it and again brew it as a kind of a fruit drink, first energy drink. They would grind up the green bean, put it with animal fat, and take it traveling with them as sort of an energy bar, if you will. But it wasn't until sometime in the 1400s that somebody figured out to roast that green bean, grind it up, put it in hot water, and make coffee the way that we know it today. In Ethiopia, they developed a ritual of roasting the beans on kind of a big flat wok over a bed of coals. And they would do it while everyone was gathered around, and you could smell the aroma of it. They would then grind it in a mortar and pestle, and they would brew it with a few spices often. And they would give 1 cup to you, and then a second, and then a third, and it was all very traditional and ceremonial, and it was what you socialized over. And it's quite an elaborate, and remains quite an elaborate ceremony.
American-produced coffee is grown on Uncle Sam's Big Island of Hawaii on the Kona coast. The coffee here grows in an ideal climate and environment along a 20-mile corridor on the slopes of Mount Hualalai. Coffee grows in a belt 30 degrees north and south of the equator, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, all around the world. Coffee requires altitude to successfully grow a high-quality bean. It's generally best somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level. Coffee requires shade to lock in the flavor at the end of the day. But here, all the rules are broken. Here, the highest altitude is only about 1,500 feet. That's not very high for quality coffee. Also, there's no shade. How does good quality coffee grow without shade? Well, here in Kona, the heat of the day rises, and it sucks in all the moisture off the volcano, creating clouds that cover the coffee plants. Also, here, the soil is nurtured by the volcano Mauna Loa, creating rich, deep mineral soil. Beautiful stuff. These are the characteristics that make quality Kona coffee. Silverio, can you show us what's inside this coffee cherry? Okay, so we've got the fruit, and inside are the 2 cherries. The fruit is actually very, very sweet, although you really don't want to eat it. Inside the cherry are the 2 beans, which once washed and dried will become our coffee bean, ready for roasting. There are 2 types of coffee in the world, Arabica and Robusta. Arabica grows on the highest elevations, and the highest elevation means the highest quality. Robusta grows on lower slopes and is generally used as filler for commercial coffee, not specialty coffee. By the 15th century, coffee had crossed the Red Sea to the port of Mocha in Yemen, where it became the nectar of Arabic peoples. Let me share something with you. The monumental expansion of Islamic peoples from Arabia since the 7th century guaranteed that coffee would spread around the world hundreds of years before the Europeans even knew about it. The Arabs loved it and took to it immediately. It is said that even the Prophet Muhammad praised the stimulating powers of coffee to further and strengthen the hours of prayer. And it was the Sufi monks, like the Christian abbots in Ethiopia before them, who first drank coffee for that purpose. Coffee had become the preserve of the Arabian Peninsula. By the 15th century, Arabs were already roasting and boiling the bean. Coffee had become a recognizable drink. Shukrum Habibi. They called it the wine of Araby. But let's not forget, this is an addictive drink. And before you could say Arabica, it was already being sold by vendors in the streets and in the souks. And where people meet and drink a beverage that alerts the mind, they tend to speak their mind. No, I wasn't talking about the coffee. I love the coffee. Coffee houses were beginning to become places where discontent was spread and radical ideas would emerge. In Mecca, coffee houses served flocks of pilgrims, and the wine of Araby rallied people against the agents of authority.
By 1511, there were coffee houses all over Yemen. There was one in Mecca, and the governor of Mecca was named Khair Beg. And he didn't like the coffee house because people would begin to think more rebelliously under the influence of coffee. So they wrote satirical verses making fun of him. So he closed the coffee houses and said that coffee was bad for you and that you shouldn't drink it. The people hated this. They got the Cairo Sultan to say, no, you have to reopen the coffee house. And that was the first time that, as far as I know, that coffee houses were closed, but not the last.
You know, it seems to me that by this time, coffee had become democratized. As more people began to consume it, coffee became more than just a drink. It became part of the culture. In 1538, the Ottoman Empire, under the rule of its omniscient Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, occupied Yemen in its bid to smash Portugal's commercial stranglehold in the Red Sea. Once coffee was established on the shores of the Mediterranean, it became the property of Venetian merchants, who were the masters of this sea from the 14th century. Judith meets historian Jonathan Morris in London to pick up the story.
The merchants from Turkey, from the Ottoman Empire, started taking coffee with them on their trips over to particularly the first trading port, Venice. So by the 1570s, we know that coffee is being brought into Venice really kind of for the merchants' own use. What happens after that is, of course, the European countries are limited in how much coffee they can bring in because it's only being grown in Yemen. So they start trying to get hold of coffee seeds and grow them elsewhere. And the first people to do this are the Dutch, who take them out to the island of Java in Indonesia and start bringing in coffee back from Java. So by 1720s, Java is now producing the most coffee in the world, if you like. But very shortly after that, it's the French. But there's a famous story about a French naval officer called de Clercq who sort of takes his little coffee seed in a little glass cabinet with him on a trip on the ocean, and he's sort of sharing his little water ration with his coffee seedling, and he takes it to Martinique and plants it in Martinique. By the 18th century, France is the leading grower of coffee, the French colonies, and France is the leading consumer of coffee. The next stage that we see is kind of the spread of coffee houses throughout Europe. In Vienna, the Blue Bottle Coffee House is set up by a guy with the name Kolitsky, and Kolitsky is supposed to have actually mixed milk with coffee for the first time, so he's responsible for a lot of what we see as European coffee culture.
The popularity of coffee spread throughout Europe to such an extent that during the 17th and 18th centuries, there was more than 300 coffee houses in London. Now, the coffee houses were nothing like the trendy cafes we have today. No, a true coffee house was crowded, feisty, smoky, smelly, celebrated and condemned. And it was in the coffee houses of London where the custom of tipping began. Customers would put money into a tin labelled to ensure prompt service, hence tips.
Dr. Matthew Green is a historian and broadcaster who conducts critically acclaimed coffee house tours of 17th and 18th century London. He's agreed to give me an insight into some of the famous coffee houses that once dominated the heart of the city.
So Judith, this is the spot where coffee was first sold to the public, and as you can see there's a blue plaque marking the site. And what you had here wasn't a kind of house, but something that looked more like a pop-up today. It was a flimsy wooden shack. It was kind of often on smoke and sometimes on fire, and it was on wheels, and it was opened by this man here, Pasqua Rosé, and he was actually an eccentric Greek. He spent most of his working life in Turkey as a servant to a British Levant merchant. And it was said that Pasqua brewed the finest coffee in the whole of the Ottoman Empire, black as hell, strong as death, sweet as love. No wonder then that his boss became addicted to it. And when he returned to London in 1652, he brought not only his servant, but the bitter Mohammedan gruel, as it came to be known, back with him. And this is where the revolution began. And to everyone's surprise, coffee became a smash hit. Within a matter of months, he was selling over 600 dishes a day. So this is the Simpsons Chop House, but it began life as a coffee house back in the 17th century. And inside places like these, they drank a drink like this. So would you like to try some
I would love to.
authentically brewed 17th century coffee? I'll pour some out. It's going to be a bit of a shock to the system.
Ooh, that looks very thick.
It's very thick. It's very gritty.
It smells so strong, even from here. Okay.
Yeah, so you're grimacing. It's disgusting. And that's not just the case that your taste buds are more refined. People at the time found it disgusting as well.
Yeah.
It was commonly referred to as like oil, ink, soot, mud, and most commonly just excrement. One early sampler said it reminded him of a syrup of soot and the essence of old shoes. So it was a vile drink. But what people did like was the way that it sobered them up, because until the arrival of this drink, most people were either slightly or very drunk all day long. Not because we were a nation of alcoholics, but simply because people couldn't drink the river water because it was so polluted. So the arrival of coffee triggered a dawn of sobriety that lays the foundations for spectacular economic growth in the decades that follow as people think for the first time in their history.
By the mid-17th century, the coffee bean had traveled from Ethiopia to Yemen and onward to Mecca, where the world's first coffee houses were built. Occupying Ottoman Turks then established a coffee house in Cairo and exported roasted coffee beans from Alexandria to its dominions in the Middle East. Damascus boasted the first Turkish coffee house, and the idea soon caught on in the imperial capital of Istanbul. Meanwhile, Venetian merchants were trading coffee in Western Europe, and by the early 17th century, coffee was being imported and coffee houses were proliferating throughout the Christian world. The Dutch then took coffee to New York in 1660. Call me a traitor if you will, but there's nothing on earth like a good cup of tea. What's not to like about tea? It's cool and refreshing in the hot weather. It's hydrating. It prevents cancer and fights diabetes. It lowers cholesterol. And if you drink a cup of black tea, you get some of the caffeine kick that you would get in a cup of coffee. So it won't surprise you to know that it was the drink of choice in colonial America. 1.2 million people drank the stuff every day. It was the drink of our colonial masters, the English, their luxury export from China that they served in abundance throughout the continent. Actually, they rammed it down our throats. America, a nation of tea drinkers, who would have believed it? Surely only a revolution would give coffee its big break. Now there's a thought. Boston, one of America's oldest cities. It was the coffee hub of 18th century colonial America. Although it was the Dutch who first brought the bean over to our promised land 100 years earlier, to New Amsterdam, now known as New York. However, as soon as the English Puritans started to settle New England, coffee found its adopted home.
But it tasted awful. Sailed across the Atlantic and up the Hudson on musty sailing ships, down in the hold with casks of wine, tarred rigging, and rats. New England Puritans would never have liked the taste of coffee, but like the British excrement, it steeled the mind and energized the body. Puritans working the soil in the promised land would allow coffee to achieve a legitimacy that alcohol never could. It's hard to believe, but before there was a Dunkin' Donuts, before there was a Starbucks, and 150 years before the American Revolution, colonial folks started their day in a tavern like this, hoisting a mug of beer or ale. Puritans though they were, they drank beer or ale because it was a better bet than water, which was unsafe.
The taverns of British America became integral to consolidating settlement life. They were places to drink, eat and sleep, rest your horses, read the daily news, and sell your crops. As more and more colonists visited these inns, coffee was added to the menu, and there was a good reason why.
The Puritans did not take kindly to inebriation. In fact, they fined anyone who was even remotely drunk. They hired innkeepers who were paragons of sobriety, women mostly, because they weren't allowed to drink, and they kept their menfolk on good behavior. Give them a cup of joe and send them off to work.
The Boston Tea Party, a cataclysmic event that sealed Britain's fate and assured coffee's fortunes in America. It took place here on the waters of Boston Harbor.
Coffee entered the American vernacular the night a group of angry Bostonians dressed up as Mohawk Indians and boarded an East India Company clipper. They hurled $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. It was December 1773, and after this event, coffee became the drink of patriots. So I'm down here in Boston Harbor where the Tea Party took place, and I just want to talk to a couple local folks and see what they think about the event. Hey, how you doing?
Doing good.
So listen, let me ask you a question. What do you think of the Boston Tea Party?
All I know is the Indians or something on a boat and they were throwing tea bags over.
Where'd that happen?
They didn't have
somewhere
tea bags.
Over there.
It was tea bags.
They didn't have tea bags.
I don't know.
Okay.
That's all I know. I didn't learn that in school.
What do you know about the Boston Tea Party?
They were protesting something.
Okay. Do you know what they were protesting?
I think it has something to do with taxes.
Yeah, they dumped the tea cascades into the sea.
The whole shipload was dumped into the harbor rather than
being taxed
or something like that.
Well, it was part of the revolution.
Did you know that after the Boston Tea Party, America stopped drinking tea and turned to coffee? Because that's when we said to England, take your tea and stuff it. We're going for a good cup of joe.
Protest, right?
There we go.
Protest.
So coffee is independence.
Yeah.
Coffee's a lot stronger.
So
that's why
symbolic.
all Americans are all hyper.
Are you a tea drinker or a coffee drinker?
Neither.
Oh.
I drink only water.
America's resort to revolutionary action against the British Crown came to a head in Boston's downtown meeting house. In these hallowed Pilgrim halls, angry colonials vented their spleens on a tea tax levied by His Majesty's government to pay for a mounting national debt, an expensive 7-year war with France, and shoring up the sagging fortunes of the multinational British East India Company. So, we poor American subjects took to voicing our protest in here while we were boycotting the object of our immense dissatisfaction, that bloody drink, tea.
In fact, one of the meetings the sheriff came to, and the sheriff had a proclamation from the governor. This is an illegal gathering. So he is allowed to come in and read this. The crowd is silent, and then the crowd simply hisses. Imagine having 6,000 people hiss at you.
Wow.
What a sound that would make. That resounded. The sheriff left. He didn't have any part of this. And of course now we see, hey, we've gotten the sheriff out of here, where the tea merchants want to have the provincial government take possession of the tea. The tea is sitting on ships in Boston Harbor. We don't want to have any part of this. Later on, actually, in Annapolis, a fellow brings a ship in, the Peggy Stewart. Unbeknownst to him, he said, someone had put 17 cases of tea. And he is afraid they're going to tear down his house because they're so outraged at the tea. So he has to go aboard his own ship and set it on fire to show everyone, I'm not bringing in any tea. Not only that, destroying 17 cases of tea, plus this ship. His loss would be, today would be close to $1 million he lost by burning the ship, but he thought it was well worth it. Otherwise, he thought he would lose his life.
What's the moment here where things explode?
Under British law, you have 20 days for a ship can come into port and leave port without paying taxes. After 20 days, the tax has to be paid. So everyone knows that. December 17th is the date by which the tax has to be paid. On the night of December 16th, the crowd gathers here, and the emissary goes to ask if Governor Hutchinson will allow the ships to sail. He won't. They come back with this message, and Samuel Adams in the pulpit says, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." And with that, from the balcony, there's a war whoop. And out in the street, there's a war whoop as about 150 men from the Green Dragon Tavern, from Eden Gill's printing shop, and from a carpenter shop now converge on this scene, dressed as Mohawk Indians. They have blankets over their heads. Their faces are smeared with paint so no one will recognize them. And they make their way down to the docks, and the crowd begins following them.
That sounds pre-planned. I mean, these guys just weren't hanging around dressed as Indians for no reason.
No, they knew that this was coming. So this is a very well-organized thing. These are the Sons of Liberty, and they're dock workers, they're longshoremen, guys who would gather in taverns and in coffee shops, and they knew one another, and so they're responsible for making sure none of the tea is unloaded. So they've been studying the ships now for 20 days. It's a very well-organized, well-coordinated thing. And John Adams says, "I don't know who any of these Mohawks were, and I don't want to know." And he calls this a sublime moment. He says this is an epic in history.
Yeah, but it didn't really start here. This was the meeting house. The planning started in the coffee houses and the taverns around Boston. That's
Right.
where revolution gets fomented. So
Yes.
what were some of the places here in Boston?
Well, the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, or the Green Dragon, Red Lion.
Yep.
And then coffee houses like the Exchange Coffee House or the London Coffee House.
So there were a lot of places where small groups of men and women were meeting and talking about a revolution.
Exactly, because the governor can suppress a big public meeting happening here, but if 20 guys are getting together at a tavern, they're just having a drink.
What are they drinking?
Well, they might have been drinking a lot of rum, and they also would have been drinking coffee. And this is a tradition that's going to continue, of these gathering places where men are getting together to talk about ideas. And
over coffee.
Over coffee.
This is interesting because this parallels what was going on actually in the Arabian Peninsula as well. In the coffee houses of Mecca, people got together and they would discuss the issues of the day and get all jazzed up and foment dissent. And in fact, the revolt against the governor of Mecca started in a coffee house, just like our American Revolution seems to have started in the coffee houses of Boston.
That is, and people get together and coffee clarifies the way you're thinking. And here, of course, we're listening to the minister. In Mecca, you're listening to the imam. But if you're in a coffee house, you are listening to each other.
Or not listening to each other.
Exactly.
Right,
Even
okay.
better.
The very first coffee house in America started right here in Boston in 1689. Here at the Green Dragon Tavern, red-coated British officials, bewigged colonial governors, all sorts of people met. Patriots from the Boston Tea Party sat and debated. That's why Daniel Webster called the Green Dragon Tavern the headquarters of the American Revolution. Now, wait a second. I'm going to go have a cup of coffee and start a revolution. Hey, anybody want to talk about uprisings and injustice around here? Bloody limeys.
After the Tea Party, drinking coffee became an act of patriotism, and as America entered a 19th century steam-powered by industrial progress, coffee became appropriately democratized, readily available to the masses. Over to Judith.
What really turns America onto coffee is when there are changes in the way that the coffee itself can be roasted and packaged from about the 1850s. And we start seeing famous companies like Arbuckle's, like Folgers, like Hill's, who start roasting the coffee and also grinding the coffee and then packing it in cans. Now, because they can seal it into the cans, they can distribute it across America. So at the time, there are two things that are going on that really make that important. One is the Civil War, because the soldiers really need something to keep them awake. Boy, they have to be awake, they've got to be fighting, so they use coffee. So this kind of, early packaged coffee is carried with them in their rations. And the second thing, of course, is all those people trekking to the west, the cowboys and so forth, are using this kind of packaged coffee out on the range. So that really grows the coffee market, if you like, and the expansion of coffee. And coffee really becomes an American drink.
Exploring the frontiers and waging a war across borders took young Americans out into the wilderness. And with such vigorous activities, coffee was the soldiers, the cowboys, and the frontiersmen's best friend.
especially when served hot besides a campfire at the end of a grueling day. The U.S. Army had seen the galvanizing powers of a caffeine hit, and its consumption became an essential part of a soldier's diet even before the Civil War of 1861.
30 years earlier, President Andrew Jackson made sugar and coffee the daily ration of every soldier, giving him the strength to fight. Or, as one commentator said, happiness and moral courage. It was certainly cheaper than a gill of whiskey. The advent of the steamship and the railroad with their steel walls instead of their smelly wooden hulls allowed the coffee to remain fresh longer and not have that musty smell. An innovation in packaging, the paper bag, allowed coffee to be transported across the country by commissary officers. Each soldier was given 1/10 of a pound of green beans as a daily ration, and the method of dividing them was nothing short of a sacred ritual. Each soldier would take his green coffee and roast them and grind them as needed to keep the coffee fresh. Each company had a portable grinder. After a long day of marching and battles, the soldiers would come and slump down by the campfire and get warm on a cold night. It was coffee before meals, coffee during meals, and coffee after meals. And if you were standing guard, it was coffee as often as possible. Who goes there?
Packing techniques developed around the time of the Civil War were refined further in the early 20th century with mechanization, until the next great coffee innovation. This is going to be the part that makes you true coffee lovers snarl your lips in despair.
Say, who gets to make the coffee in your house? Well, you know, more often than not, when it's coffee time in this household, I get to make it. Of course, the fact that my wife lets me make the coffee tells you how amazing Instant Maxwell House must be. It's a completely different kind of coffee. Now, you can see it's not a powder, not a grind either, but millions of tiny, hollow flavor buds of real coffee. Now, these miracle flavor buds burst instantly the moment you pour in hot water, flooding the pot with that wonderful, good to the last drop flavor. I want to tell you that is real coffee. Instant Maxwell House, the amazing coffee discovery.
We've come a long way since the 1950s in cultivating our taste buds.
But go back 100 years ago, and this was the hit of the new century. Instant coffee. Several inventors tried to get in on the instant coffee craze, but it was a guy named George Constant Lewis Washington who brought it to the masses. Therefore the name, Cup of George.
George Washington invented his instant coffee brew in 1910, and it played a big part in keeping American soldiers alert to the demands of battle in World War I. Our soldiers then took Instant's biggest brand, Nescafe, to a Europe fighting a Second World War, and for the first time, America's tasteless coffee became a global brand. The war also gave coffee a new name, Joe, after the nickname for the U.S. fighting man, G.I. Joe. Thankfully, Luigi Bizzarra's Gaggia espresso machine, a 1900s electrical marvel of hissing steam and refined brewing, was at hand to spare Italy and Europe from instant coffee's malevolent spell. Judith explores the wonder that's the Gaggia.
It would be fair to say Italians are passionate about their coffee. So much so, you would think they had discovered it. Well, they didn't, but they have invented a coffee culture unequal to anywhere else in the world. Over the last 50 years, espresso has been considered by many to be the best coffee to drink.
That's because espresso is the base of many of the best coffee drinks.
And this is the Fiamma 61, made in 1961. This coffee machine revolutionized coffee. Before this machine, all the coffee machines used to boil water, push it through the coffee, and used to burn the coffee. This machine was a lot softer, a lot cooler, and it used to have a wonderful system where it would move the water around internally, and so it would never burn the coffee. It was really, really forgiving. It never made a bad coffee. This is an authentic Italian espresso.
Looks good. Ah, buonissimo.
America didn't yet enjoy the benefits of the espresso machine. It had instant coffee and delivered it in the most iconic of culinary establishments. The diner is to Americans what the Italian cafe is to Europeans, though possibly the coffee in Italy tastes a little better. Thank you, Amber.
You're welcome.
She knows the way I like it. But our cup of joe is the symbol of a former luxury commodity that's become our nation's favorite hot beverage, rounding out the coffee craze that began with the Boston Tea Party. Mass production, instant coffee, the diner, we call this the first wave. The diner is a New England phenomenon. Its design evolved throughout the transformative years of the 20th century until it achieved its iconic look. The Art Deco exterior, stained glass windows in this stainless steel shell, the 1950s neon lights. You can still find diners on state highways across the country or in small towns and cities where the locals have kept alive this incredible tradition. The American Diner was established in Rhode Island in 1872 as a lunch wagon for night shift workers and late-night gamblers. Yep, this is where the cup of joe got entrenched into the American subconscious. The idea evolved into the 24-hour joint, serving cheap homemade food and replacing the tavern as the local meeting place. The diner became the pub of the New World.
Good morning.
Hey, how's it going?
All right.
What are you drinking?
Oh, that New England flavored coffee stuff there. What do you got in your cup?
I got diner coffee.
Oh, that's why it tastes like it does. It's diner coffee.
It's diner coffee.
I think we should head down the road to Dunkin' Donut myself and go get us a real coffee, but...
You're a Dunkin' Donuts guy, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Dunkin' Donuts.
Everybody's got their opinion, right?
Yeah.
Well, here's to you.
When you want a good cup of joe, Dunkin' Donuts is the way to go.
Okay. The diner seems to take us back to square one again. Unremarkable coffee, wholesome, fulfilling food, all designed for basic functionality and expediency. We Americans like to work hard, and we got to start our day and get going. The challenge of later 20th century America was, now that you've got a nation hooked on cup of joe, how do you persuade them to move on to something tastier, more authentic? Honest Joe, not your average Joe. From the eastern ports to the western seaboard, Americans took to coffee with abandon. The drink became the nation's indispensable best friend, and during the 20th century, it wouldn't take long for American coffee culture to impact the world.
To Seattle.
How's it going? Let's do it. Seattle's got the bluest sky in the country. Then there's the other 12 months of the year. But hey, it is the coffee capital of America. Alfred Peet was probably the key figure in the American coffee revolution of the 1960s. He was originally from Holland, and he grew up in the coffee business through his family. Like many European immigrants, he was probably shocked at the quality of the bitter black brew he experienced when he came to America instead of the style of coffee he was used to at home. And he was determined to do something about it. When Alfred Peet opened a small coffee shop in Berkeley, California, few noticed that a revolution was brewing. His coffee was unlike anything Americans had experienced so far. Fresh Arabica beans, just as freshly roasted, producing a taste that was rich, dark, and complex. Little did Pete know that he would inspire a new wave of coffee entrepreneurs, most notably 3 buddies who went on to found the world's largest coffee corporation, Starbucks. Starbucks' humble beginnings can be traced to Seattle's Old Wharf in Pike's Public Market. Judith takes a tour around the brand's first store.
Here in this coffee house, the story of Starbucks coffee began. Though this is not just the story of coffee. This is the story of the American dream in the form of a coffee bean. From dishwasher to millionaire, from an idea to an empire. Hi there. Can I get a latte, please?
Sure thing.
Judith, I have a brand new latte for Judith. Thank you. Yeah, have a great day. So can you imagine? This is where the Starbucks empire all began. I mean, from this tiny little place. And just look how small it is. It actually used to be a farmer's market back in the early 20th century, where they would roast and sell their own beans.
Starbucks has become so well known and so big that many people look at it as, you know, this huge corporate behemoth now.
The Starbucks revolution starts in 1971 in Seattle on America's West Coast, when 2 teachers and a writer, Jerry Baldwin, Zed Siegel, and Gordon Bowker, take an $8,000 loan to start selling roasted coffee beans and equipment from a tiny store in Pike's Market on the Puget Sound. Starbucks gets named after a shipmate in Melville's Moby Dick, and a mermaid is adopted as its logo. Skip ahead 10 years, and Howard Schultz becomes Starbucks' head of marketing. He's sent to Italy to sample the cafe culture and the delicious drink made on the espresso machine. Schultz returns to America a converted man, but he fails to convince Bowker and Baldwin that the Italian model is the future of the U.S. coffee industry. So he leaves the company in 1985 and sets up his own coffee service, aptly called Il Giornale. It proves a successful business, and his soaring profits allow him to buy up Starbucks from its founders for $3.7 million. And so, the new Starbucks is born. It becomes a public company in 1992 and starts to brew sugarized and creamy coffees and teas. It gathers inspiration from the most artisan of coffee houses that allows them to deliver tailor-made recipes to its customers, such as the Frappuccino, which it takes from the Boston Coffee Connection, and the pastries which it pockets from the Canadian Boulange bakeries. Starbucks has conquered 65 countries by opening over 23,000 stores worldwide, and so the second coffee revolution is born.
Howard Schultz was this Brooklyn kid who had street smarts. He'd read a book called The Great Good Place by Ray Oldenburg about how people needed a third place, not just home, not just work, but a place to socialize. And we were missing that in the United States. In Europe, they had the cafes. So Howard Schultz really realized that we needed a place where you weren't going to get drunk, where people from all age groups could come for a community experience, or what he came to call the Starbucks experience.
Welcome to the magical world of Starbucks in the 21st century.
You know, I think the great thing about coffee is that before specialty coffee came along, people didn't really pay attention to what was in the cup. It was just a hot black coffee. And I think what Starbucks was able to do is introduce a taste of place and an origin and more meaning behind each cup of coffee, and introduce flavors from the island of Sumatra, and introduce more than just brewed coffee. We introduced espresso to the US on a larger scale. And then we've been able to really expand that to a range of coffees, and then also a range of experiences in a place where you can gather and enjoy your coffee and get your coffee.
Recently, Starbucks has tried to join sort of the third wave, as it's called, of coffee. So Starbucks has begun to try to tap into that with Starbucks Reserve. Not only are we concerned about good coffee, but we want it to be absolutely the best coffee from a particular hillside. You want a direct contact with the people that are growing the coffee. So they're kind of jumping into this whole notion of third wave specialty coffee.
I would say the third wave revolution of coffee refers to a generation of coffee producers, roasters, artisans who are obsessed over quality at every stage of production, elevating coffee beyond a commodity into something that can really be a form of livelihood for the farmer, and also can deliver something at the end of the day which is worth that value, you know, taking it to the level of something like wine.
So, Andrew, has coffee changed America?
I think what's changed over time, especially in the States, is people are getting more and more interested in the provenance of things that they consume. We're able to, on a coffee sense, really bring to life the taste of place of the farmer who grew that coffee and create ways in which people can interact with not just the coffee itself, but different beverage preparations. And so that, for me, is what's been so remarkable about a fruit that comes off a tree has been able to do that in the States that nobody thought possible.
In a sense, the artisan movement can be traced back to the mid-1800s, when American entrepreneurs such as Henry Nicholas Greenwell started growing their own Arabica beans in Hawaii. I meet Henry's great-grandson Thomas, who explains how the Kona coffee grown on his grandfather's land became a world leader.
By 1873, he sent coffee to the World Fair in Vienna, Austria, and he was awarded a certificate of excellence from the Kaiser of the World Fair.
Wow. Vienna at the time was the coffee capital of the world, and it had a lot of high-quality coffee. So all of a sudden, this British adventurer, more or less, entrepreneur, comes along with a couple of bags of coffee from some island, and he cops the honors at the fair.
Well, I believe that put Kona on the map.
So that's the start, basically, of the specialty coffee industry in Hawaii and then in what becomes America, from the seeds here to all over the world.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Tom continues the family tradition and grows exquisite Kona coffee on his Greenwell farm that's in such demand around the world. Ripe red cherries are picked by hand. Each tree yields about 2 pounds of green coffee beans a year from roughly 9 pounds of fruit. The fruit is thrown into a depulping machine that separates the beans from the fruit. The fruit is depulped by a spinning bladed shaft. The beans released by this process get washed in a channel or gutter of rushing water. Unripe beans float to the surface, while the heavier, mature ones sink to the bottom. The mature beans end up in a tank where they soak overnight to remove the gooey outer layer called honey and begin the fermentation process. Finally, the coffee beans are dried and raked on large flat beds.
Once the coffee beans are dried and processed, roasting transforms the green coffee beans into the aromatic brown beans that we purchase, either whole or already ground. This process, called pyrolysis, is at the heart of what produces the aroma and the flavor of the coffee we drink.
Roasting is generally performed in the country which has imported the coffee, so the freshly roasted beans reach the consumer as quickly as possible. I'm meeting up with James Hoffman, the author of the World Atlas of Coffee and owner of Square Mile Coffee Roasters, a multi-award-winning company in East London.
So James, where do you source your beans from?
So we source coffee from all over the world. The thing that's important to us is that it comes from ideally a small farm or a small group of growers, but also that it's freshly harvested. So different coffees harvest at different times of the year. So all year round we're looking for coffee and they're coming in here. And when they arrive as a raw seed, basically. We call it green coffee because it's unroasted at this point. And then our job is to take those coffees and then to roast them, which is what's going on behind you here.
So tell me about the roasting process.
They go in these machines, and the way they work is that generally there's a drum inside them. And the job of the drum is to tumble the coffee around in the air because it's the air that's going to do the roasting. So we have these big burners in the machines that heat the air, and that hot air flows through the drum and really does most of the roasting process. And what we can do is we can smell, and we can look and we can measure the temperature and we can see how the coffee is roasting, just to kind of bring out the best flavors of that particular coffee.
And at what temperature are they ready to go?
And when it comes out, it's maybe 200, 210 degrees Celsius. It comes out into a cooling tray. And then we're going to try and cool that down within 3 or 4 minutes.
Oh, wow.
So we just we use air and giant fans just to sort of suck air through to cool it down.
Okay.
And then once it's nice and cool, we might then blend that coffee if that's what's going to happen, or we may not. We may keep that separate and sell it as just coffee from just one farm. It'll go off to be packed, bagged up so it's nice and fresh, and then on to a consumer or maybe a cafe.
Great.
Most artisan cafe roasteries are independent, locally owned businesses that have a great following in their local neighborhoods, and they work hard to create a relationship with the coffee farmers they buy from. One of these is Cafe Vita. They have 9 cafes throughout the Pacific Northwest, and they have a public brewing school, that's PBS for short, as well as a comprehensive barista training program. Let's check them out. Daniel.
Hey, Dean. How's it going?
Great, man. What a place you got here.
Welcome.
I'm surfing the third wave now.
All right, welcome.
Whoa, the roasting room. This is the heart of the operation, huh?
Yeah, here it is.
Okay, what's this one over here?
This is a 12-kilo Probot.
Uh-huh. Is this, like, did you start on a machine like this?
Yeah, this is about the size of the roaster we started at. Cafe Vita started in 1995. It was founded by Mike McConnell in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle.
Cool. And you're in 9 different neighborhoods around Seattle?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Wow, cool. Yep. All right, now this is a big roaster. What is it?
So this is a 45-kilo Probot. This is built in the 1930s. We bought this roaster from Cafe Trieste in San Francisco.
Sure, one of the
so
oldies.
It's quite possible that Kerouac drank coffee roasted on this machine.
That's as artisanal as you can get, right?
Yeah.
Very cool. How many pounds a week do you guys do in this place?
You know, it varies between probably 30 and 40,000 pounds a week. We have customers across the United States, you know, goes to different cafes, restaurants, grocery stores, that sort of thing.
But you roast it all here?
We actually have other roasting facilities as well. Yeah, we like to roast our coffee close to where our customers are.
Sure.
So we can deliver it fresh. Comes straight out of the roaster.
Yep.
And it gets packaged up and delivered the next day.
Wow.
Yep.
Soup to nuts. Like the milkman. You make it and get it out to them right away.
Exactly.
Okay. So do you serve the same coffee in each cafe?
Yeah, we have the same offerings in each cafe, but we rotate on a daily basis. And throughout the year, we rotate our coffees as well, as seasonal coffees come in from different origins.
Right, because part of the focus of the artisanal aspect of what you do is the seasonality, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Coffee is a crop, it's seasonal, it's not always growing, you know.
And the customers you have out here, they're like a different crew in each neighborhood, right?
Oh yeah, every neighborhood has its own personality.
Personality is the key, isn't it?
Absolutely, yep.
So you and I both spend a lot of time in Indonesia.
Indeed.
Yeah. What's your relationship like with, for example, the Sumatran farmers? I know you work with Ika. We do too. Irham and Company.
Yep.
What's what's your relationship like?
Well, we visit them on a regular basis. We have direct communication with them. We understand how the crop is going every year. And we also work with them in order to work in a particular area within the cooperative.
Right.
So we have a specific coffee that we can offer our customers that's traceable to the region, to the area, to the producers, that is unique.
What's the name of the region?
It's Atulintang.
Atulintang,
Yep.
great. Yeah, I'm kind of partial to Indonesian coffee myself. It's frankly my favorite country in the world. Saya suka kopi dari Indonesia. Enak sekali, don't you think?
Ya, saya juga suka kopi dari Indonesia.
Tentu saja. Okay, so it seems like you're trying to keep the artisanal experience by duplicating it in each of your locations. Is that your business model?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in order to be artisanal and to be focused on quality, you can't grow past a certain size where you lose touch with your product. It has to be hands-on, attention to detail, delivered fresh, delivered local.
And so, is that what keeps your customers satisfied?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it.
Great.
Daniel invites me to his cupping. It's the coffee equivalent of a wine tasting. Breaking a thin layer of ground coffee crust unleashes the aroma of the magic potion within.
Well, Shall I hazard a guess where these coffees are from?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, judging by the very smooth and soft aroma that's coming out, I would say these are like Peruvian or South American beans.
Yeah, you're right. Most of the coffees on the table, like I said, we're cupping them blind, but I happen to know where most of these are from, and we have some Colombians on the table.
Yep.
A Peruvian coffee on the table, one Costa Rican, and a Guatemalan.
Isn't it amazing how different parts of the world have such different profiles?
Oh, absolutely. You know, even within the same country or the same farm, you can get coffees that taste quite different from one another.
Right side of the hill, left side of the hill.
Exactly.
Great.
And now, time to taste the coffee.
So what are you picking up here?
I'm picking up a nice bright note, something like citrus or a ripe pineapple, sweet, syrupy.
Okay,
a little bit of milk chocolate underneath there.
Wow, you're going deep.
Yeah, there's many layers to it, I would say.
So at Cafe Vita, how do you know when someone's got the stuff to be a good cupper?
Well, you have to be really passionate about coffee, for one. You know, you have to love to do it. And you have to be open to trying to express yourself with the coffee, to relate it to somebody else, so we can all communicate what we like or don't like about the coffee. Not everyone's going to have the same taste.
And that's the thing about coffee. Being the democratic drink that it's become means that we all have our own take on how we want it sourced and how we like to drink it. American Ideals served up in a caffeinated cup.
I like it black, but if I do put anything in it, I like putting a little bit of honey and coconut milk.
If I hear about a really amazing farmer that worked really hard to make a bean and the bean tastes good, I'm gonna like it a lot more than, you know, something that someone just says like, oh, this is good because it's good.
A day without coffee is like a day without air.
I usually get just black drip coffee or lattes.
If it's early in the morning, I'm having a rough time, I prefer a shot in the dark.
Hi, Judith.
Hi, Dean. Thank you.
So, Judith, you and I have been on this incredible voyage around the world of coffee. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think has been a big impact on our societies from coffee?
Well, Dean, I think coffee has been democratized. Coming across the pond, it's become a drink for the everyman. And what about you, Dean? You have been a pioneer in this coffee industry for 20 years. Do you think coffee has changed America?
Yes, I think it has changed America. And America is always about change and reinvention. And it's really important right now because we're going through yet another motion of change. And that is that the artisan movement helps us see coffee not so much as a mass market commodity, than as a food. So, I think there's a lot that's been done, but our coffee revolution is not finished yet.